following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana Kersner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for going good crazy. This week, we're gonna meet an autistic person. He's a very unique autistic person in that he, like me, works in radio, and this isn't an expected job for an autistic person because it requires dealing with a lot of change and a lot of people. But that's going to be the point of this entire show. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Autistic people have a lot of other aspects of their personality, and autism itself is a spectrum experience, meaning everyone who is autistic has different challenges and different strengths. My guest this week happens to, have autism, or be autistic and also has OCD. Radio announcer Blake Crash Priddle. Blake can be heard on 95.7 FM in Halifax, and you'll be hearing from him here after the first break. Like I said, Blake has autism and OCD, and he wrote an incredibly charming book about his life so far called Good Morning Blake, Growing Up Autistic and Being Okay. Now, where to begin describing autism? What the heck? Let's go with Wikipedia, just as a baseline, right? Quote, autism, also known as autism spectrum disorder, is a neurodevelopmental condition characterized by differences or difficulties in social communication and interaction, a preference for predictability and routine, sensory processing differences, focus, interests, and repetitive behaviors. For a formal diagnosis, these characteristics must cause clinically significant challenges greater than what is typical for a person's age and culture and must affect several areas of daily life. Motor coordination difficulties are common but not required. Now, what's known as the autism spectrum was formally adopted, the way we understand it now, in 2013. It includes what used to be 5 separate conditions, base autism, childhood disintegrative disorder, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, otherwise known as PDD-NOS, Asperger's syndrome, and Rett syndrome, which is a condition almost exclusively seen in girls. Wait, what? Yeah, that's one of the myths about autism. Hold on to your butts. We'll get there in a minute. If you're one of those people who thinks that suddenly everyone has autism, every kid has autism, consider that, first of all, it's just more things are called autism now, but it's also no longer surrounded by so much shame. If 20% of the population is neurodivergent, 40% of the population is neurodivergent. Who cares? As long as everybody, gets the opportunity to learn and work and feel accepted in ways that allow them to learn and work and be accepted, right? There's a lot of stuff out there about autism that is just flat wrong, even though it might be popular. Vaccines don't cause autism. I repeat, vaccines don't cause autism. They don't trigger autism. They don't do anything with autism. That is correlation, not causation. People tend to get vaccinated before the age of 2, which is right where autism symptoms start showing up. It's just coincidence. Girls can be autistic as well as boys, which is why Rett syndrome is significant, being brought into the umbrella. Autism is not a disease. It's a neurodivergency. It's a neurodevelopmental difference, okay? Autism isn't caused by bad parenting. And there's this idea out there that autistic people have no empathy, which is something I want to clearly address before we get to Blake because, Blake's amazing. When some people say empathy, what they're usually referring to is a specific type of empathy, emotional empathy or affective empathy, which means that you share in the experience of the emotions of the people around you. When you're with someone who's sad, you feel a little or a lot sad too. And it's easier to be happy when others around you are happy. autistic people have fully intact affective empathy. They care about other people's feelings. They feel happy when they're happy. They feel sad when they're sad. If people are scared, they get scared, right? In fact, some autistic people have heightened affective empathy and can become enmeshed or overwhelmed by other people's emotions. In simple terms, autistic people can and do care, often very much, about other people, you know? Some autistic people also have antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and a personality trait known as Machiavellianism. These conditions are marked by a lack of affective empathy, caring about people in real terms, right? Not just an extension of your own ego. So because autism can exist comorbidly, I'm doing the air quotes here with my fingers, even though you can't see me. That doesn't mean the autism is the reason they struggle with feelings. Struggling to name your feelings and struggles having empathy, not the same thing. And that's where many autistic people do struggle. Not only naming and being able to sort their own feelings, but understanding exactly what someone is feeling, why they might be feeling that way. When they understand, they care. They just may need a little help with the sorting. That sorting is called cognitive empathy. That it encompasses perspective taking, putting yourself in the other person's shoes, and something called theory of mind, which is the understanding that other people have their own intentions, beliefs, and desires, which may differ from our own, but are still valid. Blake gets into that stuff regarding politics in his book. It's really quite interesting. So in short, a narcissist or somebody with antisocial personality disorder understand why someone's upset, but, they may not really care. Whereas an autistic person very much cares that someone's upset. They just may not understand why. When someone lacks cognitive empathy, again, this is not something all autistic people struggle with or struggle with to different degrees, right? We're generalizing here. It's also called socio-emotional understanding, or understanding why other people do the things they do, which, let's face it, that's a mystery for the ages with some people, right? The point is that autistic people may struggle with cognitive empathy, and yet they care very much when other people feel bad. So the potential to be overwhelmed by other people's emotions is extremely high. This is one reason why autistic people may not respond, big air quotes, normally to emotions, either their own or other people's. Now, I'll save some of this, the overwhelm, the idea of normal, when I talk to Blake. Again, hold on to your butts. It's going to be awesome. Many autistic people are also very reliant on routines and rituals to feel stable. Again, though, every autistic person is different. They all have their own unique balance of personality traits as well as expressions of autism. So, for instance, an extroverted person like I assume Blake is based on his book, he's going to respond very differently to social situations than an introverted person like me. Not all autistic people are introverts. Autistic people are people. And yet I've found that even some therapists who are trained to understand things like, personality traits, right? They have trouble recognizing that because autistic people are people, everyone is different. I've been pretty shocked at the way some people in the mental health profession act like, sometimes it's autism is this very serious, life-destroying things that need to be corrected or else. So they try to force an autistic person to not just act like a neurotypical person, but also think like a neurotypical person. And that's a great way to trigger a meltdown because they can't, hence the term neurodivergent. Autistic people have brains that diverge from normal thinking patterns. If you heard last week's episode, so do I, right? And I found a lot of therapists tend to either assume that having autism means a client just can't flat out do some things, or they push autistic people too hard to do things that they have a skills gap in, resulting from atypical brain development. And my sort of pet theory is that's one of the problems with hiring, right? Oh, you have autism, you just can't do this. So the minute they hear autism, they're like, not good candidate. It's not true. Autistic people can be real assets in every job, just like everybody else. They're going to have strengths. They're going to have weaknesses. The point is that in a neurotypical person, you pick the candidate whose strengths outweigh the weaknesses. You don't just focus on the weaknesses, right? That's the problem with going, oh, you're autistic. You just can't be expected to. In one case, a therapist told me that a person with autism can't be expected to follow simple, clear instructions. And that if I expected them to follow simple, clear instructions, I was completely unequipped to deal with people with autism. I have a dozen clients with autism who prefer exactly those simple, clear instructions. All autistic people are not the same. It's unbelievable, right? And I just happen to know a lot of autistic people because I worked in video games. I was a video game journalist before this gig. I love autistic people, and I get really weird looks from normies about that. Now, I call myself Schrodinger's autist because I score a 70 on what's called the RADS test. It's the standardized autism test. And so I have a lot of symptoms of autism, but I'm, subclinical, right? It's that impairments in your daily life part that I read in the definition that, doesn't have the formal diagnosis. Also, I've never been, deep dive tested outside of that test. So, hey, I could be and don't know it. I just know that as a peer counselor, when I'm working with an autistic client, it is amazing to be there, to be part of them finally getting a mental health concept that they've been struggling with. And they exclaim, well, why has no one explained it that way before? And the answer there is something referred to as the double empathy gap. The idea that difficulties in social interaction are or aren't entirely the fault of the autistic person, right? It's not all one person's fault in a communication when it goes bad. It's a mismatch in how autistic and neurotypical people express and process feelings and concepts. In order to have good communication, both perspectives have to be valid. And it drives me crazy that people forget that when it comes to autistic people. If neurotypical people are supposed to be these incredible communicators and autistic people are supposed to try to understand why other people think the way they do, well, then neurotypical people should also be working to understand why the autistic people in their lives feel and think what they do, right? It seems so simple when you put it that way, but it's not, which is why I like to have autistic people on from time to time. I did an episode a while back about regular everyday autistic people, but after the break, I'm going to introduce you to, well, I'll call him an exceptional person overall. Blake Crash Priddle, radio announcer and author of Good Morning Blake, Growing Up Autistic and Being Okay. He'll be here after the break, and I'm going to ask him about some of this stuff because there are a lot of great insights in that book. Do you have a story you think would be good for the show? Are you interested in sponsoring the show? Liana at NotTherapyShow.com is my email. NotTherapyShow.com is my website. At NotTherapyShow on socials. Being autistic and being okay. Coming up on It's Not Therapy.
The following
following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in Us Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We're still talking about growing up autistic and being okay. And the man who inspired the title of this episode is here with me now. I'm super excited to welcome Blake Crash Priddle to the program. Blake he's done a lot of work in radios, and he's currently on 95.7 in Halifax as a news anchor and reporter. And Blake has written a fantastic book called Good Morning Blake, Growing Up Autistic and Being Okay. Blake, welcome to It's Not Therapy.
Thank you for having me, Liana.
Now, you say in the book, and I stole this for the first segment, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And this is really, really critical. So I want to say to everybody, Blake is just speaking for himself. Anything he says is just his opinion and his experience. It's not blanket for everybody with autism. Where I want to start, Blake, is you have some really interesting things to say about the term normal. And I share a lot of your opinions about the idea of normal and what the term normal does. This show is a normal-free zone. I actually try not to use the word, but what do you feel about the idea of normal and how it affects development and then adult issues like employment and socialization?
Well, I quote Whoopi Goldberg, normal is just a setting on a washing machine.
Right.
There's, we're all people and we all deserve to be treated with respect, whether we're, neurotypical or neurodivergent. It shouldn't matter.
Yeah. And I mean, you're not only, you talk in the book about the fact you're not only autistic, you have OCD as well. And you ended up being very, very successful in radio. So what kind of things did you find the most challenging? Because obviously radio isn't the first career people think of for people with those, situations and experiences.
No, of course not. And one of the biggest issues was learning how to communicate. And I had, speech therapy, throughout my early childhood. And the book mentions that I went from being nonverbal to a radio announcer. And I want to clarify for people that might be confused by the term nonverbal. Nonverbal doesn't necessarily mean that a person can't talk at all. It could mean that their vocabulary is severely limited. It could mean that they repeat stuff only through echolalia, which is just repeating words that they hear, not even knowing what they mean. In my case, I was able to repeat words, but I didn't know what they meant. In the book, when I was just a little baby, my mom said to me, "Good morning, Blake." And I said to her exactly what she just said. And, that's considered a form of being nonverbal. Like I said, it doesn't mean you can't speak at all. It just means that you speak differently. Can't have a conversation, only repeat the stuff that you hear, say words that you don't know the meaning of, and at the same time also not being able to communicate your needs. So that's another way of describing nonverbal. It's like not everybody that's blind, is completely blind. Some people that are blind, they can only see, shapes, or they can tell when it's light or when it's dark, but that's still considered being legally blind. Same thing with being deaf. My grandpa can hear, but he has hearing aids, so he's considered deaf, even though he is not completely deaf. So I just want to make that clear from the get-go.
Yeah, a lot of your childhood experiences that you talked about in the book sounded very familiar to me. The intense sensitivity to loud noises, the speaking in your own language. My family said the same thing about me. And the inclusion of your mom in the book is one of my favorite parts. What was the thought about the format of bringing other people's, opinions and experiences into the book?
Well, I wanted to know what other people thought about me when they first met me, and what they perceived when they saw me doing things that were considered unusual. And that's what a news reporter or a journalist does. They always try to get different perspectives, and in this case I was able to do just that. And I was really surprised at all the responses, and none of them were negative either. I learned about things about myself from other people's perspectives that I wouldn't have known otherwise, because normally we just don't talk about things like that. For example, one person, said, you are a very sensitive guy, Blake, but you are also very caring, and it inspired me that, you had such a big heart, and things like that. That's another misconception, is we don't feel empathy. Like
Hmm.
that is nowhere near the truth. Sometimes we feel too much of it, and when you add OCD into the mix, it can be it can drive you crazy.
Yeah, I talked in the first segment about the difference between cognitive empathy and effective empathy.
Yeah.
And the fact that, the autistic people that I work with, they have so much affective empathy. They're hyper feelers, right? They enmesh, but they don't necessarily understand why the big emotion is there, and that leads to, the dreaded meltdowns. And you talk about the meltdowns and the lashing out quite frankly in the book. Do you want to let people know some of the things you experience? Because I mean, obviously, working in the media, things are going to get pretty tense. And how did you learn to process? I won't say control because it's not really possible.
Well, it just it was a long road ahead, and
Hmm.
I had to, I learned from an early age, how to manage overstimulation in an effective way, and uh, I think exposure therapy really helped. My parents were not afraid to take me outside my comfort zones. A lot of parents with children with autism are reluctant to do that because they're afraid of what other people might think of them if their kid has, a tantrum, which, by the way, is not the same thing as, a tantrum that a kid throws in public because they didn't get an ice cream or something.
Right.
No, these kinds of tantrums, it's like having a panic attack.
Yeah.
It only seems like, it only seems like a temper tantrum from the outside, because especially for little kids, they don't know how to deal with that overstimulation in a mature way because they're just little. So that's why it's best, not to judge. And I think my own mother had to learn that the hard way too. Like, before she became a mother, she used to go to, stores out in public, and she'd see kids acting up, and she'd used to say things like, "Oh my God, why are these parents letting their kids walk all over them?" Because, believe me,
Right.
if I was that boy's mother, I would never allow that. But as soon as she figured out, what it was like to have, a child, especially one that's neurodivergent, she said, okay, you know what, maybe there's something more to this. Maybe I shouldn't be so, judgmental. And that's another, a good example of perspective taking, which was something that I struggled to do, especially as a teenager. And perspective taking can be something like, if you see somebody at the door, you know, you should hold the door for them. That kind of thing. Don't ignore things like that. That's one perspective taking lesson that I learned from my parents.
Yeah, and we're talking, if you just joined us on the radio, we're talking to Blake Crash Priddle. He is also a news anchor on the radio in Halifax. He's the author of Good Morning Blake, Growing Up Autistic and Being Okay. Now, what you just said made me want to go about three different ways, so I'm just going to pick one. This, back and forth about letting autistic people, or any kids, quite frankly, try things and fail. Parents, understandably, don't want their kids to be stressed, but a certain amount of stress is a good thing. You talk about this in the book, right? That your parents let you try things. You had to wear scratchy clothes sometimes, but you didn't have to do it when it wasn't necessary. What do you think, based on your experience? This may be too difficult a question to answer, but we're going to try. What's the like good pain zone for this? What's pushing someone enough, or what was pushing you enough, and what was too much?
Well, I think, I think teachers and parents not understanding that, it's good 100% to challenge the autism and to put somebody outside their comfort zone, but at the same time, it's also good, to know when enough is enough, especially if it gets to the point where the kid can no longer function effectively,
Right.
or if they're, stressed beyond reason. That's when it's time to stop. And Temple Grandin, one of my heroes, who I interviewed a long time ago, and that interview is mentioned in the book. The one thing it talks about a lot is giving what's called a loving push. It means putting a kid outside their comfort zone, but making sure that they're well prepared for it. When she was a teenager, her mother said, your aunt would like you to spend the summer at her ranch. And she was hesitant to do it at first, but her mother gave her a choice saying, yeah, I tell you what, you can go there for a week and see if you like it. And if you don't, then you can come back early. And if you do like it, you can spend the whole summer. Not going wasn't going to be an option, but knowing that she had, the option to leave and to not do it again if she didn't like it, that gave her the motivation to try something new. I mean, you don't want to throw a kid into the deep water at a pool and then expect them to thrive. It just doesn't work that way.
No, that just creates a lifelong fear of swimming. To use that metaphor. Part of this, when I get into it, is the language we use to describe autism. Every so often the experts change everything on us. We went from high functioning, low functioning, which, you self-identify as high functioning. But now we're in this needs-based language, like high needs, low needs. And for me, I found it's just moving the problem around, right? Because somebody can be profoundly high needs in one area and need almost nothing somewhere else. A blanket identifier on someone really doesn't, I think, what do you think, really describe the complexities of everybody's individual experience with autism?
Well, everybody who has autism, their journey is going to be different. And I do know that the proper term for severe autism now is called profound. And I think that's still, I think that's a good way to to differentiate the difference between somebody that's high functioning. To be perfectly honest, I don't even know what the proper term for high functioning is these days. But I think it's that terminology, instead of using severe, saying profound instead, it's a good way to describe someone that may require, profound needs, 24-hour care, is not able to look after themselves the same way other people might. And it's one of those things that it just changes with the times. I mean, it's like, it's like 10 years ago, it was considered, appropriate to use the term burden, when dealing with people with autism. And now that is hugely frowned upon, rightfully so. People are saying that any child can be, a hassle to look after, but no parent in their right mind would call their neurotypical child a burden just because they're emotionally drained or frustrating. No, they would say something else like, oh my God, my kid is driving me crazy. It's emotionally exhausting. I mean, if you say words like that to describe a person with severe autism, I mean, I feel like that's more acceptable. More people would have, sympathy. But if you're using the term burden, then inevitably people are going to be offended and they're going to say, shame on you. You don't call people names like that.
Yeah, it's almost like all the language is about sucking more and more money out of unwilling governments as opposed to, actually getting the services that we need. And I'm getting political here, so we're going to take a break. We're going to come back on It's Not Therapy with Blake Crash Priddle, the author of the amazing book, Good Morning Blake, Growing Up Autistic and Being Okay. Blake is also a news anchor and reporter at 95.7 Halifax, another radio guy. So Blake, can you hang on over the break? We'll be back. We're going to talk about navigating social situations, including political discussions like you do within the book.
Sure thing.
All right. If you have any questions, comments, concerns for me about the show, my email is liana@nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is the website, at nottherapy on socials, Not Therapy Show on socials. I can't speak. We'll be back after this break. More with Blake Crash Priddle on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We are still talking to the amazing Blake Crash Priddle, author of Good Morning Blake, Growing Up Autistic and Being Okay. Blake is another radio guy out of Halifax. He's a news anchor and reporter for 95.7 out in Halifax. And Blake, there's this interesting chapter in the book, Good Morning, Blake, about talking to your friend about politics. And this was a really interesting thing because it showed sort of the intensity that things can get, right? The how to perspective take. A lot of people struggle with perspective taking when it comes to politics. Why did you include this discussion with a conservative friend of yours in the book? How does it inform people regarding understanding what it's like to have autism?
Well, people with autism tend to see things in black and white. It's hard to think the same way that other people do. Everything, is in black and white. They have a hard time understanding opinions or different perspectives or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I was talking to a friend about, how much I can't stand the Conservative Party, and he told me, that he, generally speaking, votes conservative. And I thought, hold on a minute, you're conservative, but how can that be? You're tolerant, you're not homophobic, you're not
Right.
racist, you're not a social conservative, but why do you vote conservative? That doesn't make sense to me, because I was under the impression that all conservatives, were social conservatives like Donald Trump or Stephen Harper or Derek Salone or somebody. And it just blew my mind that that a conservative could also be socially liberal. They call them red Tories or
Mm-hmm.
moderate conservatives, and I was just flabbergasted. And I was, I learned something new, and I realized then, okay, maybe this is my black and white thinking happening. Maybe not all conservatives, are the same. You can be socially liberal and you can also be fiscally conservative, meaning that you may be opposed to socialism. You may want less government interference on business or lower taxes and stuff, while at the same time also supporting LGBTQ rights and abortion rights and other things that social conservatives might not embrace. And boy, did I learn! And I got a funny story to tell you. Actually, last winter, I went to see my friend in Calgary, and years ago, I told him I would never vote conservative ever. Like, even if they promised every single person with autism in this country jobs, I still wouldn't vote
Mm-hmm.
for them. So I went up to him. This was around the time of my birthday. I went up to him and I said, "Hey there, my name is Blake Priddle, and in the last election in Nova Scotia, I voted conservative. I confess."
Oh.
Yes, I voted for Tim Houston. Believe it or not, I did. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that his government is planning to, um, I don't know what the status of it is, but from what I understand, they're planning to develop, a provincial autism strategy. I don't know all the details about that, but I recall reading about a while. I'm not a quotable source,
Mm-hmm.
but I did read something along the lines of the province implementing an autism strategy, and it came out when Tim Houston was still in office. So again, I don't know what the status of that is, but
Right.
that's one thing that got my attention. I also like the fact that he wanted to lower the down payment percentage for first time home buyers.
Mm-hmm.
He's a fiscally responsible conservative and is socially liberal. He's a red Tory, and it's just funny because I thought, I never thought in my wildest dreams that I'd be voting conservative, because most of the time, I voted either liberal or NDP, and I did something that I never thought would ever happen, and it did.
Yeah. I mean, would you consider yourself an extrovert? I don't want to assume.
Oh, yeah, no, very much so.
Yeah, and I mean, you're clearly open to new experiences. I mean, you couldn't do what you did if you wouldn't. Um, and yet in the book, you talk about those sort of fears about acceptance, like people knowing you have autism and sort of judging you for it. Have your views evolved over the years about that? I know you talk about the back and forth in the book. Where are you at now in terms of how to handle integrating autistic people into the greater community?
Well, we've come a long way, from where we were 20 years ago. Nowadays, we no longer suppress hand flapping or harmless stimming as long as it's not hurting anybody else. And using certain tools like comfort tools in public is no longer frowned upon. I was able to get through it, but sadly, a lot of people with autism back in the mid 2000s, they never fully recovered from that kind of unacceptance, so to speak. And my parents even said that if they could turn the clock back, they would do some things differently. They understand that maybe the way certain things were done back then, it wasn't quite right. And
Right.
that's what evolving and seeing past things is all about.
How did you navigate in the 2000s? Because I've got a lot of clients who still bear those scars of feeling like every time a social situation goes wrong, it's their fault somehow because they're not normal. They've got this brand of being autistic instead of it just being what is. How do you navigate that? The idea of, okay, this was my responsibility. This thing over here, maybe not so much.
Well, I can't say I've ever dealt with that kind of situation before. I'm going to be honest with you.
Okay.
I've never really had to deal with that. But I think one of the main reasons why forced eye contact and suppressing stimming back then was common practice was because they thought that they were doing the right thing. They wanted
Mhm.
they wanted people to not be judgmental or to judge somebody before really getting to know them, because they thought that if they didn't make eye contact or if they stimmed, then they might not be able to get a job anywhere. And fortunately things like that are changing. People have a better understanding of stimming and not making eye contact. So yeah, thankfully most employers are not like that. They no longer refuse to hire somebody just because they're stimming or just because they're not making eye contact, because there's other reasons why somebody could be stimming uncontrollably. I mean, you wouldn't punish somebody who's shaking their hands because they have Parkinson's, or you wouldn't penalize somebody from another culture where making direct eye contact is considered rude. So like, if you wouldn't do those things, then the same thing shouldn't be done for people on the spectrum.
Right. And that goes back to that idea of normal, right? I mean, normal shifts, what was considered some of the normal fashion in the 80s and 90s. Wow, looking back at those yearbooks is difficult. And this is sort of where we come into some of the divisions in the autism advocacy community. And you talk about these, you and your mom both talk about these things in the book. I cannot stress people listening how great the inclusion of Blake's mom is in Good Morning Blake, growing up autistic and being okay. You've had run-ins with the more, like, I'll say hardcore autism activists. Your mom has had some issues with, her perspective not being seen as valid as her perspective. I don't want to put words in your mouth. So where are you at now? The book came out in, like, what, 2021? So some stuff may have changed.
Well, what I will say is that everybody's autism journey is different. I mean, some of the people that we ran into, they were parents of people that had autism that required 24-hour care. And even if we were trying to give them some encouraging words, I mean, unfortunately, it just didn't help them to feel better. It was like giving somebody a rose even though they're choking on a piece of steak. It's just not going to help because they're so emotionally drained. So I think people, they might appear to be mean, or they might appear to be throwing things in our face, but you got to understand that they're dealing with a lot of stress. And they may be really nice people. They're just not themselves. I mean, it's like there's a slogan for a famous chocolate bar. You aren't you when you're hungry. So
Right.
maybe they're not themselves when they're under a lot of stress. But so yeah, that's one divide that we have is people that are raising children or adults that have severe, profound autism, and these are people that say, like, if I could cure my kid with autism, I would. Or like autism is so bad, or I hate it. They say those things without understanding just how much those words hurt some people.
Mhm.
Like myself, I mean, I don't think they mean to, but they're just so stressed out that sometimes they don't think about how their words affect other people. And I tell people that it's one thing to have a bad experience with somebody that has profound autism, but but saying I hate autism or I want to cure autism, you know, you can tell people that you really trust, things like that. But whatever you do, don't post it on social media, because if you
Hmm.
do, inevitably you're going to be, hit with comments from self-advocates. Like, these are people that are very proud to be autistic.
Yeah.
They'll just say, you're a very selfish person. How dare you talk about autism that way? And these are also coming from people that that appear to be high functioning, but they weren't always like that themselves. A lot of them used to have autism that was considered profound, but they got better. That's why I think, everybody from the autism community, we just can't be divided anymore. We need to come together, and we need to take the time to listen to each other's stories. And hopefully one day we can all understand each other without things getting turned into a needless war.
What do you think is the first step? Because obviously there's a lot of competing factors, right? There's, as you said, other people's emotions, and they can run really hot if, say, somebody had a really bad personal experience with ABA therapy. But there's also money. I mean, the mindset of investing in autistic kids. You know, politicians look at how much it costs and goes, "Oh, I don't know about that." But I mean, it's the difference between somebody being a, you know, income earner and paying taxes when they're older, as opposed to constantly needing government supports versus spending, not spending the money now and not making the money later. So, what do you think is a way for the various kind of political orientations and stakeholders, if you will, to kind of come together and get something done here?
It needs to be treated just the same way that healthcare is in this country. It needs to be free. It's a human right. You
Hmm.
shouldn't cuts, for things like that. Full stop. I don't. I'm going to be honest. I don't care how expensive it is. I would rather my tax dollars, go towards, helping people that actually need it, instead of, rich CEOs, getting a tax break from the government, for nothing. So we got to get our priorities in order. Autism, support services and accommodations, that needs to be top priority. It needs to be treated the same way that our free healthcare is treated in this country. Period.
Like, I want to close with possibly my favorite quote in your book. It was tough to pick, but it was, "No one should ever say my life is ruined when something bad happens. If you're still alive and still breathing, your life is far from ruined. There will always be a rainbow at the end of the storm." And then you just quoted it, "me." What was your thought about putting little things like that in the book?
I wanted to inspire people. I see, people all the time, posting, just how depressed they are, and you'll say, "Oh, my life is ruined," or, "Why do these things always happen to me?" Listen, you are breathing, you are alive. That is a blessing. Sometimes feeling those negative emotions, it doesn't feel good, but it reminds you, when you feel these negative emotions, you're a human, you're alive. Pain is good. Pain is your friend. If you're feeling pain, it means that you're still alive, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a blessing that you should never take for granted. And I had to learn that the hard way, and I want everyone to remember that.
All right, great place to stop. Blake Crash Priddle, author of Good Morning Blake, Growing Up Autistic and Being Okay. In the book, you can also find the perspectives of 50 of Blake's peers, family members, friends, teachers, and work colleagues who demonstrate it takes a village to raise a child. That's from the back of the book. You can hear Blake if you're out in the Halifax area at 95.7. Blake, how do other people get in touch with you? You got some social media that you respond to.
Yeah, I have Blake Crash Priddle on Facebook. I have Instagram, which I don't use that much. And I have a website, blakecrashpriddle.com. And yeah, I would prefer that if you're going to contact me, please make sure that you put something, very clear in the heading, so that I know what it is that you want to talk about, because I'm going to give you all a fair warning. Any, junk mail or spam emails, I will not be opening them. Just FYI. Another thing is, I host a podcast called The Medley. with Blake Crash Priddle, and that's available wherever you get your podcasts as well. And I interviewed Stephen Kersner, better known as Ed the Sock, and that was a lot of fun. So listen to that.
What's the name of the podcast again?
It's called The Medley.
So that's BlakeCrashPriddle.com for all things Blake. Blake Crash Priddle, PRIDDLE.com. Blake, thank you so much for coming on It's Not Therapy.
Hey, my pleasure. I had a lot of fun.
All right, when we come back, quick wrap up on tonight's show. Questions, comments, any feedback, Liana at nottherapyshow.com is my email. Nottherapyshow.com is the website, and at nottherapyshow for social media. When we come back, growing up autistic and being okay. Final thoughts on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We are still talking growing up autistic and being okay. And I got about 2.5 minutes left because Blake was interesting and I went long. That's the way we roll when we have interviews on It's Not Therapy. I want to focus on one of my top 10 phrases for the final thoughts on this episode. And that top 10 phrase is listen twice before you talk once. And one of the things I feel so fortunate about working with a lot of autistic people is that their perspectives tend to be pretty amazing. I learn a lot about people just listening to other people's stories. I think Blake commented on that in his final thoughts, but I'll hear something from one person and then instead of going, oh, that can't be so, just dismissing it, I'll go to another person who has sort of similar experiences and say, hey, I heard this recently. What do you think about that? And they'll either say, yeah, that's absolutely right, or it's not quite like that, but it's more like this. And being able to piece together this mosaic of humanity based on individual stories is an amazing, amazing part of the work I do. And I'm really, really grateful to be able to do it. Every story like Blake's, every story like yours is really important. Again, Blake's book is Good Morning Blake, Growing Up Autistic and Being Okay. It's Blake Crash Priddle is the full author's name. And I really enjoyed it. It's a super fun book. It's good for not only people with autism, but also the families of autistic people who might be trying to figure out what the heck is going on. It's laid out in really awesome, clear terms. So I'm super grateful for Blake coming on and talking to this. And I am out of time. Questions, comments, concerns, any feedback, Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Nottherapyshow.com is the website. At Not Therapy Show. Why do I keep messing that up? I don't know. But hey, another episode down. Thank you for listening. Thanks for Blake for coming on. And remember, your crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. See you next time.